In this video I wanted to share a few tips about buying your first wild discus. Well, there's a lot of information on YouTube and online about buying your first discus fish, but most of this information is about buying your first domestic captive bred discus, which are a bit different from wild species of discus. So there are a few issues that are very specific to wild discus, and it's important to know them before you decide to buy your first wild discus. So I think this video might be useful for you if you decide to buy your first wild discus and you're considering which species of discus to buy, which size of fish to buy, or how to select a healthy and good quality wild fish. Before we get any further, I would like to mention that some of the pictures and footage that I use in this video are of my own fish, but quite a lot of them were kindly provided by Hudson Crisanto from H&K Discus, which is possibly one of the largest and also, in my opinion, one of the best discus exporter companies in Brazil, which specializes in wild discus. So we'll start with talking about different species of wild discus. If you start doing your research about wild discus, you will realize that there are as many color varieties. I don't use the word strains because these are not strains, these are geographic color varieties of wild discus, as they are of domestic strains of discus. Generally, there are three species of wild discus. Haeckel's discus, which is quite easily recognizable by this vertical black bar in the middle of their bodies. The second species is green discus, which is what I have in my tank. They have this greenish bodies with lots of red or black spots throughout their bodies, so they're also very striking looking fish. The third species is brown discus, and it has a subspecies blue discus. So brown discus is the most widely distributed, widely spread species of wild discus. So it has a really large habitat, and it has certainly the largest number of color varieties among these three species. Also, it's usually more widely available in the hobby as compared to the other two species. It is arguable that there are only three species of discus. Supposedly there are also two other species of discus, Tarzu discus, which comes from Colombia, and Rio Xingu discus, which is sometimes described, classified as a separate species, but these two species are not as widespread. And in case of, for example, Rio Xingu discus, which is usually brightly colored in yellow, you would rarely or ever find it available for sale anywhere in the world, so it's really hard to find this fish. That's why generally we talk about three species of discus. Each of these species has possibly more than 100 different color forms, which come from different geographic locations, catch locations. So if you look up, for example, for Haeckel's discus, you will see that there are blue moon Haeckels, blue face Haeckels. There are lots of different other color varieties of Haeckel discus. So the first thing that you will probably notice once you start shopping around for wild discus is size. When it comes to domestic discus, we can have a variety of choices in terms of size. So we can buy juveniles and we can raise them up, we can buy semi-adults, or we can buy adults or mated pairs. You would normally have lots of different choices to work with. One thing you will realize about wild discus is that most of the fish available for sale are either adults, so fully grown fish, or subadults. You would rarely or almost never be able to find juveniles, or especially like smaller individuals or wild discus. And the reason is actually simple. Most of the wild discus are collected during the dry season in Brazil or in Peru. That is when the water levels in their habitats are at their lowest, so it's easier for collectors, for fishermen to catch this fish. During the rainy season, during the dry season, the waters are really high, so discus are spread out across their habitats, and it's extremely hard hard to collect them. So that's why most of the discus that we have for sale are collected during the dry season. So what does it mean in terms of size? Discus, just like most other Amazonian fish, breed during the rainy season. That's when there is an abundance of food for both adults and fry, and during this several months of rainy season, discus fry usually manages to reach sub-adult size. So before the dry season hits, you will never be able to find juveniles or fry. Most of the discus available during the dry season will be either adults or sub-adults who have grown, who were born during the rainy season, but they have grown up before the dry season starts. So that's why fish collected during the dry season, they either sub-adults or adults. It is also more profitable for collectors and fishermen in the Amazon region to collect and sell larger fish, because they fetch higher prices as compared to juveniles, and they would prefer collecting larger fish rather than smaller fish. Larger fish or adult fish, they would in most cases be fully colored, so they will be bright and colorful. Younger fish, it takes wild discus, I will talk about it in a moment more in details, but it takes wild discus quite some time to get fully colored and to look beautiful. So sub-adults are usually quite gray, striped, and they don't look very nice. So that's why most exporters as well as importers of wild discus, they prefer dealing with adult fish, because this fish cost more, they look more beautiful, and they're more appealing to customers. What this means for us hobbyists is that most of the time we have to invest in buying adult fish. Of course, adult wild discus, they cost more than many strains of domestic discus, so it's always an investment to buy a group of wild discus. On the plus side, adult specimen of wild discus, they are usually hardier than younger juveniles, because they're easier to adapt to different environments, and I've noticed that grown-up discus, they're quite hardy and easily shipped and transported, so there are very few issues with them. Okay, the next tip is which species of wild discus to start with. As I've said before, there are generally 3 species of wild discus available on the market, with different color varieties, geographical variations. So which one is more appropriate for a beginner? So if you have experience of keeping domestic strains of discus, you would find it relatively easy to deal with green discus and brown discus, because these 2 species are quite hardy, and in most cases they will be hardier and easier to keep than many domestic strains of discus fish. When it comes to Haeckel's discus, these fish are used to live in black water, highly acidic, soft conditions, and so unless they have been successfully adapted to live in your water, in the water in that area where you live, it might be a bit tricky to get them used to your water, because you will have to use initially RO, reverse osmosis water, and you will have to acidify your water in order for them to get used to these conditions. So that's why I would not recommend you starting with Haeckel's discus. I would recommend you starting with brown discus, pretty much any available color variety of brown discus. And regular brown discus are usually quite widely available, and they are not too pricey. If you don't go for red forms or orange forms or any other special forms like Ica form, which has this vertical black bar in the middle of their body, if you start with regular brown discus, they are usually not too expensive, and they're also very hardy, so they would be able to adapt to your conditions quite efficiently, and you will most likely have very good experience with keeping this fish. So this can be your starter introduction to the wild discus keeping, and from brown discus you can get upgrade it to green discus, for example, and this is what I have done. I have started with brown discus. My first wild discus were brown discus. Then I moved to slightly more expensive and slightly rarer forms, color forms of brown discus, and finally now I'm keeping green discus. I've never had Haeckel's discus, and possibly in future I plan to get them as well. So the next tip is color. When you will see wild discus in retailers' tanks, or when you will actually, if you're buying fish online, when you will receive your first wild discus, you will be probably shocked by how colorless these fish are, by how gray, brownish, and how ugly they look, to be honest, because most of the time when you first see wild discus or you first receive them, they will not show their colors, even if they're fully grown fish and they are in stressed out condition, which is usually the case for wild discus in retailers' tanks, or when you just introduce them to your tank. They will be just gray or brownish with the stress bars over their body, and they will probably have no colors at all. This is quite normal because it takes a while for wild discus to settle down and to start displaying their colors. In case of subadults, it would probably take them half a year to actually grow to a sufficient size and to start showing their colors. In case of adults, they would need at least a couple of months to settle down, to get used to your conditions before they will actually sparkle up with a rainbow of colors. So you really need to be patient with wild discus, and that's one of the things, because lots of people, they see wild discus in retailers' tanks and they just realize how ugly these fish are, and they're also expensive, so there's no point of buying this fish if you can buy colorful domestic strains. But this is a bit of a delusion, because eventually wild discus will become way more colorful than many domestic strains of discus. So, and the last aspect to consider, often you will see wild discus with quite a bit of fin damage, tail damage, some scars on their bodies, and these fish sometimes are cheaper. Most of this fin damage and body damage comes from piranha bites, because in the wild, discus are frequently preyed on by piranhas, and unlike what we see in movies or documentaries, piranhas don't tear into pieces the whole fish. Instead, they prefer to grab chunks of fins or tails, or chunks of scales from a fish, and to swim away. So a lot of discus have this natural scars from piranha bites. Most of the scars are healed, and they don't negatively affect the fish, and it's just about the visual discomfort that we get by looking at this fish. But other than that, these fish are perfectly healthy, and I've previously had some of my brown discus with scars from piranha bites, and also some of my current green discus, they have some signs of long healed piranha bites on their tails, but this doesn't make them any different from any other fish. Okay, so just to summarize, first of all, when you're buying wild discus, don't be afraid to buy larger fish, because most of the fish available on the market will be adults or semi-adults, so searching for juveniles can be pointless. And also buying older fish, larger fish, you get more chances these fish will adapt to your conditions well. Also, don't be discouraged by the lack of colors of your wild discus or the fish available for sale. It takes them a while to color up. Don't be discouraged by fin damage or body damage, because this is something that a lot of discus fish have in the wild, and that's quite normal. And possibly the most important tip for beginners, it's better to start with brown discus, and it's better to go with the cheaper and more common color varieties of brown discus, just regular brown color with blue stripes, with a few blue stripes on the head, will work perfectly fine. So there is no need to invest a lot of money into rarer varieties and more pricey varieties. So I hope this video was useful. Leave your comments and questions in the comment section, and I will see you soon.